The afternoon light fell with particular gentleness across the gardens of Thornfield House, where the wedding eve celebration for Miss Celia Hartwell proceeded with all the careful orchestration that such occasions demanded in the village of St. Mary Mead. The bride-to-be moved among her guests like a pale flame, her white dress catching the dappled sunlight that filtered through the ancient oak trees. Tomorrow she would marry Mr. James Pemberton, the London solicitor who had quite swept the village off its feet with his charm and evident prosperity. Miss Jane Marple, seated unobtrusively near the rose garden with her knitting basket, observed the festivities with the mild interest she brought to all human gatherings. She had noted, with the gentle curiosity that served her so well, the slight tension in young Celia's shoulders and the way Mr. Pemberton's eyes followed his fiancée with an intensity that seemed to go beyond mere devotion. The bride's aunt, Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell, presided over the tea table with the authority of one who had organized every significant social event in the village for the past 20 years. "Such a lovely couple," murmured Mrs. Bantry, settling beside Miss Marple with a plate of cucumber sandwiches. "Though I must say, there's been rather a lot of whispered conversation between Celia and that photographer fellow, Mr. Ashworth. He's been here since yesterday, taking pictures for the London papers, you know. Quite the society wedding, apparently." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly as she observed Mr. Ashworth adjusting his camera equipment near the garden's center. He was a nervous, thin man with restless hands and the sort of mustache that suggested careful attention to appearances. His photographic apparatus included not only the usual camera, but also a small metal pan and several tins marked with precise labels. Flash powder, she supposed, though it seemed rather elaborate for an outdoor afternoon. The vicar, Reverend Clement, was making his way through the gathering with the determined cheerfulness of one fulfilling social obligations. Young Dr. Morrison stood near the refreshment table, his attention divided between the conversation of Colonel Bantry and frequent glances toward Miss Sarah Fleming, Celia's chief bridesmaid. Miss Fleming herself appeared somewhat distracted, her fingers worrying at the ribbon of her hat as she watched the photographer's preparations. "Ladies and gentlemen," called Mrs. Hartwell, her voice carrying easily across the lawn. "Mr. Ashworth would like to take the formal group photograph before the light changes. If the wedding party would gather near the sundial, please." There was the usual pleasant confusion as people arranged themselves according to some invisible hierarchy of importance. Celia took her place at the center, a spray of white roses in her hands, while Mr. Pemberton positioned himself just behind her left shoulder. Miss Fleming and the other bridesmaids fluttered into position like butterflies finding their flowers. Mrs. Hartwell claimed her rightful place as family matriarch, while the gentlemen sorted themselves with the particular awkwardness that men display when being organized by women. Miss Marple remained in her chair, content to observe. She noticed that Mr. Ashworth seemed unusually nervous, checking and rechecking his equipment. The flash powder apparatus appeared more complex than she remembered from previous village photography sessions. There was something about the way he handled the metal pan that suggested either great care or great anxiety. "Now then," Mr. Ashworth called, his voice carrying a slight tremor, "please look toward the camera. I shall count to 3 and there will be a brief flash and some smoke. Don't be alarmed by the brightness." The group settled into their poses, faces turned expectantly toward the lens. Celia's smile seemed particularly radiant, though Miss Marple thought she detected something almost defiant in the young woman's expression. Mr. Pemberton's hand rested possessively on his fiancée's shoulder. "1," counted Mr. Ashworth, his hand hovering over the flash pan. "2." The explosion, when it came, was far more dramatic than anyone had expected. Instead of the usual modest puff of smoke, a great billowing cloud erupted from the photographer's equipment, dense and acrid, rolling across the group like fog from the Thames. Exclamations of surprise and mild alarm rose from the assembled guests as the smoke obscured everything in a gray-white veil. Miss Marple, watching from her position outside the photographic group, observed the smoke's movement with interest. It seemed to hang lower and longer than natural, and she caught a whiff of something that reminded her, oddly, of the chemical smell from the village chemist's shop. The cloud drifted slowly toward the hedge that bordered the garden's eastern edge. When the air finally cleared, perhaps 30 seconds later, the group stood blinking and coughing, their careful arrangement somewhat disrupted. Mr. Pemberton was brushing ash from his jacket sleeve, while Mrs. Hartwell fanned herself vigorously with her handkerchief. Miss Fleming had stepped backward and was staring with wide eyes at the space where, moments before, her friend had stood. The white roses lay scattered on the grass, where they had fallen from suddenly nerveless fingers. Of Miss Celia Hartwell, bride-to-be, there was no sign whatsoever. She had vanished as completely as if she had never existed, leaving behind only the lingering scent of chemicals and the echo of shocked silence that followed Mr. Pemberton's strangled cry of, "Celia." Miss Marple set down her knitting with particular care, her mild blue eyes already noting the small details that others, in their shock and confusion, were overlooking entirely. The bride, it seemed, had quite literally disappeared in smoke. The garden erupted into that peculiar blend of courtesy and chaos which characterizes English gatherings when confronted with the impossible. Mrs. Hartwell's voice rose in sharp crescendo, calling her niece's name with increasing desperation, while Mr. Pemberton stood frozen where his bride had vanished, staring at the scattered white roses as though willing them to reassemble into the woman he was to marry tomorrow. The photographer, Mr. Ashworth, sat heavily on the garden bench, his face chalk white and hands trembling as he stared at his equipment with the expression of a man whose world had suddenly ceased to make sense. "She must have slipped behind the hedge," declared Colonel Bantry with military certainty, already striding toward the garden's eastern boundary. Startled by the flash, no doubt. Young ladies can be quite sensitive to sudden explosions. Several gentlemen followed him, crashing through Mrs. Hartwell's prized herbaceous border with the enthusiasm of men finally presented with something practical to accomplish. Dr. Morrison had taken charge of the photographer, who appeared to be suffering from shock. "I don't understand," Mr. Ashworth kept repeating, his voice barely above a whisper. The mixture was perfectly standard. Flash powder, nothing more. "I've used it hundreds of times without incident." Miss Marple approached the scene with the gentle curiosity of someone interested in modern photographic techniques. The metal pan lay overturned, coated with gray residue that carried a distinctly acrid scent. There was something beneath the chemical smell that reminded her of young Johnny Fletcher's chemistry experiments in her neighbor's garden shed. "Such remarkable effects these modern chemicals can produce," she murmured to Mrs. Bantry, who hovered nearby with the air of someone torn between offering comfort and demanding explanations. "My late nephew was quite fascinated by chemistry. He once created the most extraordinary smoke using saltpeter and sulfur. Quite harmless, but it did obscure everything most effectively. The immediate search proved fruitless. Colonel Bantry emerged from behind the hedge looking disheveled and unsuccessful, while Reverend Clement organized systematic examination of every possible hiding place. The ladies clustered around Mrs. Hartwell, offering comfort and increasingly wild theories about Celia's disappearance. "Perhaps she's had some sort of nervous collapse," suggested Miss Fleming, her voice high with anxiety. "The wedding pressure, you know. Some brides do find it overwhelming." Her own nervousness was evident in how she twisted her bridesmaid's bouquet, scattering petals across the lawn. Village Constable Mella arrived shortly after, summoned by one of the more excitable guests, and began taking statements with methodical thoroughness. The gathering quickly separated into distinct factions. Mrs. Plummet declared confidently that Celia had simply fled with cold feet, while Mr. Davies insisted on kidnapping, citing Mr. Pemberton's evident wealth as motive. Dr. Morrison leaned toward scientific explanation, suggesting volatile chemical reactions, though his expertise lay in human anatomy rather than photography. Run off in a puff of smoke? Scoffed Davies. It's clearly kidnapping. London solicitor, big house, someone seen opportunity. This theory gained traction among those who relished dramatic explanations, while others whispered about supernatural possibilities. Miss Marple had wandered closer to the photographer's equipment, noting that one chemical tin bore a label that appeared to have been recently applied over older lettering. The original text showed faintly beneath, "Magnesium powder, professional grade." The newer label read simply, "Flash powder, standard mix." "Mr. Ashworth," she said gently, "I hope you don't mind my asking, but have you been experimenting with different chemical combinations recently? My nephew was always fascinated by the various effects one could achieve." The photographer looked up with startled eyes. That is to say, one does try to achieve the best possible results. The London papers expect dramatic effects, you understand, but nothing dangerous, nothing that should have caused—" He gestured helplessly at the empty space. Mr. Pemberton finally roused himself from stunned contemplation. "We must call the police immediately," he announced with legal authority. "This is clearly a matter for Scotland Yard. Celia would never simply run away. Something has happened to her." "Now, James," soothed Mrs. Hartwell, though her own composure was fraying, "let's not be hasty. I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation. Celia has always been spirited." Miss Marple observed these developing reactions with interest. Human nature, she had concluded long ago, revealed itself most clearly during crisis. Mrs. Hartwell's insistence on maintaining proprieties spoke to character that valued appearances above almost everything else. Mr. Pemberton's immediate assumption of criminal activity suggested either genuine concern or perhaps knowledge of circumstances that might make such activity likely. Miss Fleming's excessive agitation seemed remarkable, even for a concerned friend. As afternoon light faded and reality settled over the gathering like unwelcome evening mist, the search expanded beyond the immediate garden. Not a single trace of Celia could be found, no torn fabric, no dropped shoe, no footprint beyond the scattered rose petals. It was as though the bride had been mere figment of collective imagination. The photographer's explanations grew more elaborate with each telling, and Miss Marple noted with gentle attention that his story was acquiring details absent from his initial shocked responses. The complexity of his chemical mixture, the precise timing required, the atmospheric conditions, all these elements appeared to occur to him as he spoke, rather than representing prior knowledge. The village, usually predictable in its rhythms, had become a hive of unease, each resident clinging to their own version of events. Miss Marple carefully rethreaded her knitting needle, her mind quietly sifting through layers of human reaction, sensing that the true explanation would be found not in the smoke, but in the intricate tapestry of human hearts and their carefully guarded secrets. The morning brought Inspector Slack from Much Benham, a sturdy man whose confidence in systematic police work remained unshaken by the theatrical nature of the case before him. He established himself in Mrs. Hartwell's drawing-room with the methodical efficiency of someone accustomed to reducing mysteries to their component parts through proper questioning and logical deduction. Miss Marple, invited to remain as an old family friend, settled into her corner chair with her knitting, becoming as unobtrusive as the china shepherdess on the mantelpiece, though considerably more observant. The inspector's interviews revealed fascinating contradictions in what had initially seemed a straightforward account. Mrs. Hartwell described her niece as the model of propriety, though Miss Marple noted the slight pause before she added that Celia had always been perfectly predictable in her affections. Mr. Pemberton spoke with the passionate certainty of recent engagement, emphasizing Celia's excitement about their wedding and planned Italian honeymoon, yet his hands remained clenched throughout his testimony, and he mentioned twice that she had been particularly interested in the photographer's work. Miss Fleming's account proved more revealing than perhaps she intended. Celia had been asking the most unusual questions about Mr. Ashworth's chemicals, she admitted reluctantly. Yesterday morning, she wanted to know exactly how the flash powder worked, whether it could be made to produce more dramatic effects. I thought it odd. She's never shown interest in such technical matters. The photographer himself had developed an increasingly elaborate explanation for the chemical accident. His knowledge of magnesium compounds, atmospheric pressure, and photographic chemistry seemed remarkably comprehensive for someone who claimed purely practical experience. Miss Marple observed that his handkerchief bore the monogram R.A. rather than the W.A. one might expect, though she mentioned this detail to no one. Inspector Slack seized upon the most obvious theory with satisfaction. "Classic case of wedding nerves," he declared. "Young woman sees opportunity during confusion, slips away. Probably halfway to London by now. We'll check the railway stations. These dramatic disappearances usually have mundane explanations." This theory found eager support among the villagers. Mrs. Price recalled her sister's near escape from matrimony, while Mr. Davies nodded knowingly about modern pressures on young women. The general consensus painted Celia as overwhelmed by social expectations, though Miss Marple noted that those who knew her best seemed least convinced by this explanation. Her own quiet investigations had yielded more intriguing details. The housemaid, Mary, mentioned that Miss Celia had been receiving letters from London recently, correspondence that arrived in unfamiliar handwriting and left the recipient visibly anxious. "Asked me twice about train schedules," Mary confided, though she said it was for honeymoon planning. The gardener provided another piece of the puzzle. He had observed Mr. Ashworth making multiple trips to his motor car throughout the morning, carrying equipment that seemed excessive for simple photography. Particular about his chemicals he was. Reminded me of signal flares from the war, very precise handling required. Dr. Morrison's medical assessment introduced an unsettling possibility. When asked whether chemical smoke could cause disorientation, his response was carefully measured. Certain compounds might produce temporary unconsciousness, he explained, though Miss Marple noticed his quick glance toward Miss Fleming when he mentioned pharmaceutical substances with similar effects. Miss Fleming's reaction to this medical discussion was particularly noteworthy. She excused herself twice, claiming headaches, and returned each time looking somewhat paler. Miss Marple observed that the young woman's reticule appeared lighter after her second absence, though such details might mean nothing to a less experienced observer of human nature. The village itself had become a hive of speculation. At the post office, Mrs. Weatherby declared that still waters ran deep and Celia had probably maintained secret correspondence. Mr. Prescott, the retired bank manager, insisted on kidnapping, citing Mr. Pemberton's evident wealth and London connections. Each theory reflected more about its proponent than about the missing bride. Yet Miss Marple listened to all with the gentle attention she brought to village gossip, knowing that truth often emerged from the most unexpected sources. As evening approached and the formal investigation concluded its first day, each participant carried away their own interpretation of events. Mrs. Hartwell retreated with smelling salts and determined optimism that Celia would return with reasonable explanations. Mr. Pemberton announced his intention to remain at Thornfield House, ready for any communication from his missing bride. Miss Marple gathered her knitting with thoughtful deliberation. The human heart, she reflected, was considerably more complex than any chemical reaction and far more unpredictable when subjected to pressure. Someone in this carefully composed gathering possessed knowledge they had not shared, and the bride's disappearance was beginning to seem less like impulse than careful planning. The scattered rose petals had been cleared away, but the questions they represented remained. In her experience, people who vanished in dramatic fashion usually had compelling reasons for doing so, and those reasons were invariably connected to the intricate web of relationships that bound small communities together. Tomorrow would bring fresh revelations, she was certain, for secrets had a way of surfacing when subjected to the persistent pressure of investigation, much like bulbs emerging from winter soil when conditions finally became favorable. For by the second morning, Inspector Slack had assembled what appeared to be a satisfying case against Mr. Ashworth, built upon the solid foundation of physical evidence that police work demanded. The photographer found himself installed in the village station's small interview room, his nervous explanations growing more elaborate with each telling. A grey cloak discovered in his motor car bore the acrid scent of chemicals, while his personal effects revealed the troubling discrepancy of a monogram reading Array rather than the expected W.A. When pressed about this inconsistency, Ashworth offered increasingly desperate explanations about laundry services and borrowed linens that convinced no one, least of all Inspector Slack. Miss Marple had spent the morning in her characteristically gentle investigations, which led her to examine the photographer's abandoned equipment more closely. Her knitting needle, employed with the dexterity of long practice, retrieved a crumpled receipt from beneath the driver's seat of Ashworth's motor car. The document proved illuminating. A purchase order for industrial-grade smoke-generating compounds from a London chemical supplier, dated merely 2 days prior and bearing the name R. Andrews. This was no ordinary flash powder, but rather a theatrical compound designed to produce dense, persistent clouds of the sort used in stage productions or, more ominously, for deliberate concealment. The inspector's satisfaction with his primary suspect was reinforced by additional discoveries. Ashworth's room yielded a railway timetable folded to London departures, a half-burned note advising caution in some unspecified endeavour, and a hand-drawn map marking the eastern hedge with a penciled cross. These tangible proofs appealed to Inspector Slack's methodical nature, though Miss Marple observed that the marked location corresponded to a gate that had been padlocked for months, and the timetable bore thumbprints suggesting unfamiliarity with its contents. Yet even as the case against Ashworth solidified, other currents of suspicion began flowing through the village's social channels. Mr. Prescott, whose banker's memory retained inconvenient details, let slip that Mr. Pemberton's financial arrangements were remarkably fluid for a man of supposedly modest means and recent success. Checks had been returned, accounts showed irregular activity, and the bridegroom's explanations for his wealth seemed increasingly inadequate under scrutiny. Miss Marple noted with particular interest that Mr. Pemberton had mentioned insurance considerations regarding Celia's engagement ring, inadvertently revealing that the expensive piece had been purchased only yesterday, a curious timing for a man planning marriage months in advance. Miss Fleming's testimony added disturbing dimensions to the developing picture. Under careful questioning, she admitted that Celia had received a telegram on the morning of her disappearance, one that left the bride visibly shaken despite her claims that it contained merely wedding congratulations. More significantly, Celia had been expressing growing concerns about her fiancé's secretive business practices and frequent unexplained absences. She wondered why James was so evasive about his clients, Miss Fleming confided reluctantly, and his work seemed to require far more mysterious travel than ordinary legal practice would suggest. The romantic undercurrents of the case revealed themselves through careful observation of Dr. Morrison and Miss Fleming's interactions. Their studied avoidance of each other's eyes, combined with the doctor's slip in addressing her as "my dear" before catching himself, suggested a relationship that extended beyond casual acquaintance. Miss Fleming's frequent need for smelling salts, obtained fresh from the chemist that morning, and her borrowing of keys to the linen cupboard, added layers of complexity that Inspector Slack's straightforward theories could not accommodate. Village opinion shifted like weather patterns as these revelations accumulated. Mrs. Weatherby declared she had always sensed something calculating about Mr. Pemberton's smooth London manner, while Colonel Bantry muttered about fortune hunters and their sophisticated methods. The romantic narrative of sudden courtship and country wedding began to seem less charming and more predatory as details emerged about the bridegroom's background and behavior. Mrs. Hartwell's defense of her future nephew-in-law grew increasingly strained as the day progressed. Her knowledge of Mr. Pemberton proved surprisingly limited for someone welcoming him into the family, extending little beyond what he had chosen to share about his professional standing. Her attempts to contact his London references yielded only formal confirmations that revealed nothing about his character or true circumstances. Mr. Pemberton himself faced these mounting suspicions with the composed authority of someone accustomed to legal proceedings. Yet his responses carried the careful precision of a man choosing words with professional caution. His account of meeting Celia, their courtship, and his decision to settle in St. Mary Mead was thorough and logical, but somehow unsatisfying in its very completeness. When questioned about Celia's state of mind, he offered generalized reassurances, while avoiding specific details about her recent behavior. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the garden where the bride had vanished, Inspector Slack prepared to formalize his case against Ashworth. The photographer's combination of opportunity, suspicious equipment, and evasive explanations satisfied the inspector's preference for tangible solutions. Yet Miss Marple continued her patient observations, unconvinced that the true mystery had been solved. Human nature, she reflected, rarely conformed to such tidy explanations, and the scattered rose petals had been cleared away, while the questions they represented continued blooming in unexpected directions. Though the morning brought a peculiar quality of light to St. Mary Mead, as though the very air had been charged with uncertainty following Celia's impossible disappearance. Miss Marple arrived at Thornfield House with her customary quiet purpose, her knitting basket concealing the sharp intelligence that had served her through countless village mysteries. Inspector Slack's confidence in his case against Mr. Ashworth had crystallized overnight into something approaching certainty. Yet she remained troubled by details that seemed to point in directions the good inspector had not considered. Her examination of Celia's room, undertaken with Mrs. Hartwell's distracted permission, revealed fascinating inconsistencies in what should have been straightforward preparations for a wedding day. The wastebasket beneath the dressing table contained cotton wool, bearing a distinctly metallic scent, while a powder compact showed traces of what appeared to be petroleum jelly around its edges. Miss Marple had observed similar precautions during the war years, when those who worked near chemical processes learned to protect themselves against noxious fumes. The discovery suggested forethought rather than panic, planning rather than spontaneous flight. Miss Fleming's presence in the room, ostensibly to prevent wrinkles in the wedding dress, provided another piece of the developing puzzle. Her nervous energy seemed directed toward specific tasks rather than general anxiety, and Miss Marple noted with gentle interest that several items had been moved from their original positions. A bus timetable, hastily concealed between the pages of a prayer book, bore pencil marks indicating routes to London, while an empty envelope addressed to Miss C. Hartwell showed signs of having contained something more substantial than wedding congratulations. The garden itself yielded more tangible evidence when examined with the thoroughness that Inspector Slack's focus on the photographer had not permitted. The ground where Celia had stood retained not only the expected flattening from the gathered wedding party, but also curious linear marks that suggested deliberate movement rather than random confusion. More significantly, Miss Marple's trained ear recalled a brief sound during the moment of the flash, a scraping or dragging noise that had been immediately obscured by the larger explosion but which spoke of purposeful action rather than magical disappearance. Village opinion continued its steady shift toward suspicion of Mr. Pemberton, though the man himself maintained his composed legal demeanor even as uncomfortable questions multiplied around him. Mr. Prescott's banking connections had yielded disturbing information about financial irregularities, while the local jeweler confirmed that the expensive engagement ring had been purchased with cash only days before the ceremony. More troubling still was Mrs. Hartwell's visible distress upon receiving a telegram that morning, one which she dismissed as business correspondence while displaying every sign of genuine alarm. Dr. Morrison's frequent visits to comfort Miss Fleming had not escaped notice, and their whispered conferences suggested knowledge that extended beyond medical concern for a friend's welfare. The doctor's medical bag remained constantly at his side, while Miss Fleming's reticule had disappeared entirely, replaced by a nervous habit of checking her coat pockets as though ensuring something remained safely concealed. Their careful avoidance of certain topics, when others were present, spoke of shared secrets that neither felt prepared to reveal. The photographer's continued detention provided convenient focus for official suspicions, yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that Mr. Ashworth's role, while clearly deceptive, was not the central element of the mystery. His nervous explanations about chemical compounds and photographic effects rang with the desperation of someone caught in circumstances beyond his control, rather than the calculated denials of a criminal mastermind. The monogrammed handkerchief and railway timetable suggested involvement in some form of deception, but not necessarily the kidnapping that Inspector Slack was determined to prove. Mr. Pemberton's own behavior provided the most intriguing study in controlled anxiety. His telephone conversations, when he believed himself unobserved, carried a tension that his public demeanor carefully concealed. References to delayed arrangements and urgent settlements suggested financial pressures that a successful London solicitor should not have experienced. His knowledge of Celia's habits and preferences, initially charming in a devoted fiancée, began to seem oddly comprehensive for someone who claimed a brief courtship conducted largely through correspondence. The discovery that truly illuminated the complexity of the situation came through Miss Marple's patient examination of the hedge, where Colonel Bantry had searched so unsuccessfully. A small tear in the branch, positioned at precisely shoulder height, contained threads of white fabric that matched Celia's wedding dress. More significantly, the ground beneath showed the clear impression of a woman's shoe, pressed deep into the soft earth with the force of someone moving under considerable urgency or constraint. The evidence suggested not magical disappearance, but carefully planned escape, executed with the precision that only advanced preparation could provide. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the garden where the bride had vanished, Miss Marple reflected on the intricate web of relationships and motivations that was beginning to emerge. Human nature, she had long observed, revealed itself most clearly under pressure, and the events surrounding Celia's disappearance had created precisely the sort of crisis that stripped away social pretenses to expose the calculating hearts beneath. Someone among their small circle possessed knowledge they had not shared, and that knowledge held the key to understanding not only how Celia had disappeared, but why she had found it necessary to orchestrate such a dramatic escape from what should have been the happiest day of her life. The scattered rose petals had been cleared away, but the questions they represented continued to bloom in unexpected directions, each new revelation adding complexity to what Inspector Slack preferred to see as a straightforward case of criminal abduction. Miss Marple gathered her knitting with thoughtful deliberation, sensing that the true solution would require understanding not just the mechanics of disappearance, but the deeper currents of fear and deception that had made such desperate measures seem necessary to a young woman on the eve of her wedding. The third day brought a peculiar clarity to St. Mary Mead, as though the morning light had been filtered through the lens of suspicion that now colored every interaction in the village. Miss Marple arrived at Thornfield House with her customary quiet purpose, her knitting basket concealing observations that had crystallized overnight into something approaching understanding. Inspector Slack's confidence in his case against Mr. Ashworth remained unshaken, yet she found herself increasingly convinced that the photographer's role, while clearly deceptive, represented only one thread in a far more complex tapestry of human motivation and carefully planned deception. Her examination of the physical evidence had yielded fascinating details that spoke to preparation rather than panic. The chemist, Mr. Ellaby, confirmed with professional pride that a veiled lady had purchased petroleum jelly and eucalyptus oil on the morning of the wedding party, asking specifically about their effectiveness when applied together for protection against smoke inhalation. The combination suggested someone who understood the dangers of chemical exposure and had taken deliberate precautions. More significantly, Celia's dressing table retained traces of these same substances, while cotton wool bearing their distinctive scent had been carefully disposed of in the wastebasket. Evidence of systematic preparation that belied any theory of spontaneous flight. The revelation of Mr. Ashworth's true identity as Robert Andrews, a theatrical effects specialist rather than a wedding photographer, transformed the investigation's fundamental assumptions. Under persistent questioning, Andrews admitted that his engagement had come not through normal commercial channels, but through a mysterious client who had provided specific chemicals and precise instructions for creating maximum concealment with minimum danger. The elaborate smoke-generating apparatus represented professional stagecraft rather than criminal improvisation, designed by someone who understood both the technical requirements and the dramatic timing necessary for successful illusion. Financial pressures emerged as the driving force behind the complex web of relationships surrounding the cancelled wedding. Mrs. Hartwell's distressed admission revealed that Celia's inheritance was structured as a trust requiring marriage before her 25th birthday, now only weeks away, creating urgent pressure that explained the rushed courtship and hasty wedding arrangements. Mr. Pemberton's own circumstances proved equally precarious, with Mr. Prescott's banking connections exposing a pattern of irregular financial dealings that suggested desperation rather than the prosperity he had so carefully cultivated. Most disturbing of all was the substantial life insurance policy taken out on Celia just weeks before the wedding, a detail that cast his romantic declarations in an entirely different light. The village's social fabric strained under these revelations as residents reassessed relationships they had accepted at face value. Mrs. Weatherby's post office gossip revealed a telegram received on the morning of the party, its cryptic message suggesting coordination rather than coincidence. Time confirmed. Stop 3 o'clock precisely. Stop East Hedge. Stop R. The precision of the timing and the specific location indicated planning that extended far beyond the photographer's involvement, while the initial signature suggested connections that had not yet been fully explored. Miss Fleming's nervous behavior took on new significance when viewed through the lens of deliberate conspiracy rather than shocked friendship. Her frequent consultations with Dr. Morrison, initially attributed to medical concern for a distressed friend, began to seem more like coordination between accomplices. The doctor's medical bag remained constantly at his side, while Miss Fleming's reticule had been replaced by nervous checking of coat pockets, behavior that suggested responsibility for items that required careful concealment. Their whispered conferences spoke of shared knowledge that neither felt prepared to reveal to official investigation. The mechanics of Celia's disappearance became clearer through Miss Marple's patient reconstruction of the evidence. The brass key to the eastern gate, discovered among Mr. Pemberton's belongings, despite his claims of borrowing it for constitutional walks, provided access to an escape route that had been prepared in advance. The gardener's indignant denial of lending the key to anyone confirmed that its acquisition had required either deception or theft, while the linear marks in the garden soil suggested coordinated movement during the confusion rather than random panic. Mr. Pemberton's Esther. Reactions to these mounting revelations proved as illuminating as the evidence itself. His composed legal demeanor masked increasing tension as financial irregularities came to light, while his questions about Celia's whereabouts focused on practical concerns rather than emotional distress. His failure to express the sort of romantic anguish expected from a devoted fiancé suggested that his interest in his missing bride had been primarily mercenary, focused on her inheritance rather than her person. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the garden where the bride had vanished, Miss Marple reflected on the intricate choreography that had been required to orchestrate such a dramatic disappearance. The scattered rose petals had been cleared away, but the questions they represented continued to multiply in directions that Inspector Slack's straightforward theories could not accommodate. Human nature, she observed, revealed itself most clearly under pressure, and the events surrounding Celia's disappearance had created precisely the sort of crisis that stripped away social pretenses to expose the calculating hearts beneath. The true mystery was not how Celia had vanished, but why such desperate measures had seemed necessary to a young woman who should have been celebrating the happiest day of her life. Someone among their carefully composed gathering possessed knowledge they had not shared, and that knowledge held the key to understanding whether the bride's dramatic escape represented salvation from danger or participation in something far more sinister than anyone had yet dared to imagine. The fourth morning brought a development that shifted the investigation's entire complexion, though not in the direction Inspector Slack had anticipated. Robert Andrews was discovered unconscious in the small copse behind the Blue Boar Inn, his expensive photographic equipment scattered around him in apparent disarray. Dr. Morrison, summoned hastily by the innkeeper who had found him during an early morning walk, pronounced the photographer's condition serious but not immediately life-threatening. A small glass vial, empty and bearing the faint scent of bitter almonds, lay near his outstretched hand, while his clothing showed signs of a struggle that seemed inconsistent with accidental poisoning or deliberate self-harm. Inspector Slack arrived with the satisfied air of a man whose theories were being vindicated by events. "Guilt will out," he declared, surveying the scene with professional approval. "Attempted suicide, no doubt. The pressure of discovery proved too much for his conscience." The inspector's interpretation painted Andrews as a man overwhelmed by the weight of his criminal involvement, driven to desperate measures by the inexorable progress of justice. This explanation satisfied the gathered villagers who had grown weary of uncertainty and welcomed any resolution that promised to restore their peaceful routines. Miss Marple approached the scene with her characteristic gentle curiosity, her knitting basket carried with the same careful attention she brought to all human mysteries. Her examination revealed details that troubled her methodical mind. The photographer's position suggested he had been carefully arranged rather than having collapsed naturally. The scattered equipment, while appearing consistent with a fall, lay in patterns that spoke of deliberate placement rather than random distribution. Most significantly, the empty vial bore no fingerprints on its smooth surface, an omission that seemed remarkable for something supposedly clutched in a moment of desperation. The village's reaction to this dramatic development revealed character in ways that proved illuminating to Miss Marple's experienced eye. Mrs. Hartwell retreated further into nervous prostration, her distress appearing genuine despite her previous concerns about family reputation. Mr. Pemberton's response combined appropriate shock with what seemed like relief, as though a persistent source of uncertainty had been conveniently removed. His immediate questions about the investigation's likely conclusion struck even the charitable as unseemly in their timing and obvious self-interest. Miss Fleming's behavior became increasingly erratic following news of Andrew's condition. Her frequent consultations with Dr. Morrison, previously attributed to friendship and medical concern, now seemed to carry undertones of conspiracy that had not been apparent before. Miss Marple observed that the young woman's anxiety focused less on sympathy for the photographer than on fear of consequences that had not yet materialized. Her attempts to discuss the incident in hushed tones with the doctor suggested knowledge that extended beyond what had been publicly revealed. Financial pressures emerged more clearly as the driving force behind the complex web of relationships surrounding the cancelled wedding. Mr. Prescott's banking connections had revealed disturbing information about Mr. Pemberton's true circumstances, painting a picture of desperation rather than the prosperity he had so carefully cultivated. His London practice existed largely on paper, with debts far exceeding assets and creditors growing increasingly impatient for resolution. The marriage to Celia represented his only hope of avoiding bankruptcy and potential criminal charges for financial irregularities that bordered on deliberate fraud. Most damning of all was the discovery that Pemberton had already begun negotiating with moneylenders using Celia's expected inheritance as collateral, arrangements that would have left her penniless even if she had survived the wedding ceremony. These revelations transform the romantic narrative of sudden courtship into something far more predatory, suggesting that the bride's disappearance might have been an escape from danger rather than participation in criminal conspiracy. Dr. Morrison's medical assessment, delivered with professional authority, contained subtle nuances that Miss Marple did not overlook. His emphasis on accidental poisoning seemed deliberately designed to discourage questions about deliberate harm, yet his examination of the scene extended far beyond medical necessity. His frequent glances toward Miss Fleming during his pronouncements suggested coordination rather than independent professional judgment, while his reluctance to discuss the specific nature of the poison raised questions about his own involvement in recent events. The photographer's condition, while serious, began to seem less like attempted suicide and more like deliberate silencing by someone who feared his eventual testimony. Andrews had admitted under questioning that his mysterious client had provided detailed knowledge of the garden's layout and the wedding party's planned positions, information that suggested inside knowledge rather than casual observation. His description of this unknown employer remained frustratingly vague. Yet his survival meant that further questioning might yet reveal crucial details about the conspiracy's true scope. Miss Marple's patient reconstruction of events suggested a level of coordination that extended far beyond simple financial fraud or romantic deception. The precision required to orchestrate Celia's dramatic disappearance, followed by the convenient incapacitation of the one witness who might reveal uncomfortable truths, indicated planning that involved multiple participants with specialized knowledge and ruthless determination to protect their interests. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the village, now buzzing with renewed speculation about the photographer's fate, Miss Marple reflected on the layers of deception that continued to emerge. Human nature, she observed, revealed its most calculating aspects when survival was at stake. Yet something about the current situation suggested that not all participants understood the true nature of the game they were playing. The scattered photographic equipment, like the rose petals before it, told a story of deliberate disruption designed to obscure truth that someone desperately wished to remain buried beneath layers of misdirection and carefully staged incident. The morning brought a telegram from Scotland Yard that arrived with a peculiar efficiency reserved for official communications bearing unwelcome news, delivered by Mrs. Weatherby with the compressed importance she brought to all village crises. The wire stated, in language carefully crafted to avoid libel while conveying unmistakable warning, that certain irregularities had been discovered regarding Mr. James Pemberton's legal qualifications, that his name appeared on no official rolls despite his claims, and that inquiries were proceeding into financial arrangements that suggested systematic fraud rather than mere professional oversight. Mrs. Hartwell received this information with a sort of rigid composure that precedes either complete collapse or determined action, while Inspector Slack declared with satisfaction that the bridegroom's credentials were thoroughly discredited, though he admitted that such revelations neither located the missing bride nor explained the attempt on Robert Andrews' life. The photographer's recovery, though gradual, had yielded fragments of information that transformed the investigation's fundamental assumptions about the conspiracy's scope and participants. Andrews, speaking with the clarity that sometimes follows near-death experiences, revealed that his mysterious employer had been neither Mr. Pemberton nor any stranger to St. Mary Mead, but Miss Sarah Fleming herself, who had approached him 3 weeks prior with precise instructions for creating theatrical smoke effects and specific timing requirements that demonstrated intimate knowledge of the wedding party's planned arrangements. His description of their initial meeting painted Miss Fleming as someone operating under considerable stress, yet his inability to recall specific details of their financial arrangements seemed remarkably convenient for a professional whose livelihood depended on contractual precision. Miss Marple had observed Miss Fleming's reactions to these revelations with the gentle attention she brought to all human mysteries, noting that the young woman's distress appeared to focus less on sympathy for the poisoned photographer than on fear of consequences that had not yet materialized. Her frequent consultations with Dr. Morrison, previously attributed to friendship and medical concern, now carried undertones of conspiracy that suggested coordination rather than coincidental timing. The doctor's own behavior had become increasingly suspicious as his relationship with Miss Fleming came under scrutiny, his medical bag remaining constantly at his side, while containing pharmaceutical supplies that extended far beyond normal country practice requirements. The financial implications proved even more disturbing than the personal betrayals they represented. Mr. Prescott's banking connections revealed that Miss Fleming had withdrawn her entire inheritance only days before the wedding, converting substantial assets into readily portable form, while her account showed regular deposits from unknown sources over the past 6 months, payments that coincided exactly with Mr. Pemberton's courtship of Celia. These discoveries painted a picture of coordination that extended far beyond romantic deception into something approaching professional conspiracy, with each participant playing carefully rehearsed roles in an elaborate drama designed to separate Celia from her inheritance through marriage, insurance fraud, or more permanent means. Miss Marple's examination of the physical evidence had yielded details that supported this theory of systematic planning rather than spontaneous crime. The tool shed revealed a canvas screen folded behind old trellis work, its edge bearing one fine strand of white silk crepe with a distinctive scent of eucalyptus oil, while the wheelbarrow showed fresh gouges at precisely the height of a woman's hip. Most significantly, the floor contained traces of chalky white soil, not native to the garden beds, but familiar to anyone who had walked the path to Quarry Lane after rain, a route that led to the disused railway crossing where determined travelers could board the early goods train without official notice or expense. During an afternoon gathering at Mrs. Bantry's, ostensibly organized to discuss village fete arrangements, but serving primarily as a forum for the latest speculation, Miss Marple had engaged both Dr. Morrison and Miss Fleming in conversation that revealed more than either intended. Her gentle observations about poisons and their effects, delivered with the innocent curiosity she brought to all technical subjects, produced visible reactions that confirmed her growing suspicions about their involvement in Andrews's near-fatal poisoning. Miss Fleming's nervous spillage of tea and trembling hands spoke of guilt rather than general anxiety, while Dr. Morrison's defensive responses suggested knowledge that extended beyond his medical training into areas he preferred not to discuss. The discovery of Celia's wedding dress, carefully folded and hidden in Miss Fleming's bedroom, provided tangible evidence of premeditation that even Inspector Slack could not dismiss, while the presence of a second, identical garment suggested preparation for impersonation or deliberate confusion about the bride's actual fate. These revelations transformed the romantic narrative of sudden disappearance into something far more calculated, indicating that Celia's vanishing had been orchestrated with the precision of a theatrical performance, complete with costume changes and carefully timed special effects designed to create maximum confusion while enabling systematic theft of her inheritance and identity. As evening approached and the investigation entered its most critical phase, Miss Marple reflected on the intricate web of relationships and motivations that continued to emerge from what had initially seemed a straightforward case of wedding nerves. The complexity of the conspiracy suggested participants whose knowledge of each other's secrets created both opportunity and vulnerability, while the attempt to silence Andrews indicated that someone among their carefully composed gathering feared exposure enough to risk murder. Human nature, she observed, revealed its most calculating aspects when survival was at stake. Yet something about the current situation suggested that not all participants understood the true nature of the game they were playing, and that the bride who had vanished in smoke might prove to be neither victim nor criminal, but something far more dangerous to those who had underestimated both her intelligence and her determination to protect herself from whatever fate they had planned for her. The afternoon brought an atmosphere of deceptive calm to Mrs. Hartwell's drawing room, where Miss Marple had requested the courtesy of a small gathering to discuss certain inconsistencies that troubled her methodical mind. Inspector Slack, persuaded with considerable difficulty to allow this unconventional approach, positioned himself near the window with the air of a man indulging elderly eccentricity while maintaining professional skepticism. The assembled participants, Mrs. Hartwell, Mr. Pemberton, Miss Fleming, Dr. Morrison, and the recovering Robert Andrews, arranged themselves with the careful politeness that masked profound mutual suspicion, each wondering what revelations the afternoon might bring to their carefully constructed versions of recent events. Miss Marple settled into her chair with the gentle fussiness that had served her through countless village mysteries, her knitting basket yielding several small objects which she arranged on the side table with apparent casualness. A compact bearing traces of petroleum jelly around its rim, a lace handkerchief faintly scented with eucalyptus oil, and a brass key that caught the afternoon light lay among her wool like props awaiting their cue in some carefully orchestrated drama. Her blue eyes surveyed the gathering with mild interest, noting reactions that ranged from nervous attention to carefully controlled anxiety as each participant recognized items that should not have been in her possession. "I do hope you will forgive an old woman's confusion about times and places," she began with characteristic self-deprecation, her knitting needles clicking softly as she spoke. "One gets so muddled about railway schedules and the precise timing of photographic effects. For instance, I've been wondering about the goods train that crosses at Quarry Lane. Such a reliable service, yet I've heard conflicting accounts of its schedule. Some say 3:57 precisely, others claim it varies with the weather and the driver's disposition." Miss Fleming's reaction was immediate and involuntary. A sharp intake of breath, followed by the sort of rigid stillness that comes from realizing one has revealed too much. Dr. Morrison's hand moved protectively toward her elbow, a gesture that spoke of intimate knowledge and shared anxiety, rather than mere professional concern. Mr. Pemberton's smile remained fixed, though his eyes had acquired the calculating wariness of a man reassessing his position in an increasingly dangerous game. "The precision required for Thursday's events has been much on my mind," Miss Marple continued, her voice carrying the gentle authority that made her observations seem like casual conversation rather than systematic interrogation. "The timing of the flash, the positioning of the smoke, the coordination of movement, all these elements suggest planning that extended far beyond Mr. Andrews's theatrical expertise. Someone with intimate knowledge of the garden's layout, the wedding, parties' arrangements, and most importantly, the railway schedule that would enable discreet departure from St. Mary Mead." She paused to examine the compact, turning it slowly in her fingers as though its greasy rim held particular fascination. "Petroleum jelly is so useful for protecting delicate skin from harsh chemicals, though one must know in advance that such protection will be necessary. The combination with eucalyptus oil creates quite a distinctive scent, rather like the preparations one might make before entering a chemist's laboratory, or perhaps before deliberately exposing oneself to theatrical smoke designed to obscure rather than illuminate." Miss Fleming's composure began fragmenting under this gentle assault, her hands twisting in her lap, while her eyes darted between Miss Marple's evidence and Dr. Morrison's increasingly tense profile. The doctor himself had moved closer to the window, though his attention focused not on the garden, but on calculating distances to doors and the likelihood of successful retreat from a situation spiraling beyond their control. "It reminds me," Miss Marple said with apparent irrelevance, "of a case in Little Paddocks where a young woman disappeared most dramatically, leaving behind only scattered belongings and a cryptic telegram signed with a single initial. Everyone assumed the signature indicated a mysterious lover, but it transpired that the initial belonged to her closest friend, someone who knew her habits intimately enough to orchestrate a convincing disappearance while providing herself with what appeared to be an unshakable alibi. The parallel struck home with devastating accuracy. Miss Fleming's face drained of color as the implications settled over the gathering like morning mist, revealing familiar landscape transformed into something alien and threatening. Her knowledge of railway schedules, her access to Celia's wardrobe and habits, her presence at every crucial moment of the wedding preparations, all these advantages of friendship had been systematically exploited to create the perfect crime. Dr. Morrison's protective instincts finally overcame his caution. "Miss Marple," he said with forced authority, "these speculations are hardly appropriate for a social gathering. Miss Fleming has been under considerable strain, and your implications are both unfounded and distressing." His medical bag remained constantly at his side, its contents now seeming less like professional equipment than evidence of pharmaceutical knowledge that had nearly proved fatal to Robert Andrews. Miss Marple's needles paused in their rhythmic clicking as she regarded the doctor with mild curiosity. Indeed, professional knowledge can be such a burden when misapplied. The precise dosage required to incapacitate without killing, the symptoms that would suggest accidental poisoning rather than deliberate harm, such expertise would be invaluable to those seeking to silence inconvenient witnesses. Her gentle words carried the weight of absolute certainty, transforming speculation into inexorable conclusion. The room held its collective breath as Miss Fleming's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled, her face a mask of terror and dawning comprehension that her psychological trap had been sprung with the precision of a master craftsman. The scattered rose petals had been cleared away, but the questions they represented were finally blooming into answers that would reshape everything the village thought it knew about friendship, love, and the calculating hearts that beat beneath the most trusted facades. The silence that settled over Mrs. Hartwell's drawing room carried the peculiar weight of truth finally emerging from layers of carefully constructed deception. Miss Marple continued her knitting with serene composure, her gentle voice cutting through the tension like a blade wrapped in velvet. Inspector Slack, his earlier skepticism dissolved by the mounting evidence, positioned himself strategically near the door while the assembled participants awaited revelations that would transform their understanding of recent events entirely. The afternoon post brought salvation in the form of a telegram delivered by young Tommy Fletcher, breathless from his bicycle ride from the post office. Inspector Slack tore open the envelope with professional efficiency, his eyebrows rising as he read the message aloud. "Aunt Dorothy, forgive my silence. I am safe. Do not trust statements made for my good. Wait for me. Celia." Mrs. Hartwell's gasp of relief echoed through the room, her composure crumbling into tears of gratitude that her niece lived, while the color drained from Miss Fleming's face as the implications settled over the gathering like morning frost. Miss Marple observed these reactions with the mild interest she brought to all human mysteries, noting how relief and terror could occupy the same space when truth finally displaced carefully maintained fiction. "Such a sensible girl," she murmured, her knitting needles clicking softly. "One must send something only family will recognize when circumstances prevent personal appearance. I suspect there were other communications as well, perhaps using childhood codes that only intimate friends would remember." Miss Fleming's composure finally shattered under the gentle pressure of accumulated evidence and psychological strain. "I never meant for anyone to be hurt," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the afternoon's settling silence. "It was supposed to be simple. Help Celia escape from James before he could ruin her completely. She had discovered his debts, his lies about the legal practice, the insurance policy he'd taken out on her life. She was terrified, but she couldn't simply run away without causing scandal that would destroy Aunt Dorothy's standing in the village." The confession emerged in fragments, each revelation adding complexity to what had initially seemed a straightforward case of wedding nerves or criminal abduction. Miss Fleming had indeed approached Robert Andrews, providing precise specifications for theatrical smoke effects and exact timing requirements that demonstrated intimate knowledge of both the garden's layout and the crucial railway schedule. The petroleum jelly and eucalyptus oil had been Celia's own precaution against chemical exposure, while the identical wedding dress found in Miss Fleming's room had served as insurance against discovery during the crucial moments of substitution and escape. Dr. Morrison's role proved more troubling than romantic attachment could excuse. His medical expertise had provided pharmaceutical knowledge necessary for the poisoning attempt on Andrews when the photographer's survival threatened to expose uncomfortable truths about the conspiracy's scope. I thought a small dose would merely incapacitate him temporarily. The doctor admitted with professional precision that failed to mask his moral collapse. Miss Fleming was convinced he would reveal details that would implicate Celia in criminal conspiracy rather than recognizing her as a victim of circumstances beyond her control. Mr. Pemberton's reaction to these revelations completed the picture of systematic fraud disguised as romantic courtship. His composed legal demeanor dissolved into panic as the full extent of his financial desperation became clear. The marriage to Celia had represented his only hope of avoiding bankruptcy and potential criminal charges for irregularities that extended far beyond professional incompetence into deliberate deception designed to separate a vulnerable young woman from her inheritance through marriage, insurance fraud, or more permanent means. Miss Marple's patient reconstruction revealed the elegant simplicity underlying the apparently complex disappearance. Celia had discovered the plot against her through intercepted correspondence and careful observation of her fiancé's increasingly desperate behavior. Rather than confront him directly or flee in panic, she had approached her closest friend with a plan that would use the conspirators' own deception against them. The theatrical smoke had provided cover not for kidnapping but for carefully orchestrated escape, with Miss Fleming taking Celia's place during the crucial moments, while the actual bride slipped away through the eastern gate using the brass key stolen from the gardener's shed. The mechanics of the deception demonstrated sophisticated planning that spoke to intelligence and determination rather than criminal intent. The canvas screen from the tool shed, the wheelbarrow with its telltale chalky soil from Quarry Lane, the precise timing coordinated with railway schedules. All these elements had been orchestrated to create maximum confusion while enabling Celia's safe departure from St. Mary Mead before her supposed wedding day could become her funeral. As Inspector Slack began the formal process of arrest, Miss Marple reflected on the intricate web of relationships and motivations that had driven ordinary people to extraordinary measures. Human nature revealed its most calculating aspects when survival was at stake, yet something about the current resolution suggested that Celia's dramatic escape had been orchestrated not by criminal intent, but by intelligent recognition of mortal danger from those who should have protected her. The scattered rose petals had been cleared away, but the questions they represented had finally bloomed into answers that revealed both the darkness lurking beneath trusted facades and the courage required to escape from predators who had planned destruction for financial gain. The village would return to its peaceful routines, though with the sobering knowledge that evil could flourish even in the most familiar relationships, and that sometimes salvation required the sort of dramatic measures that only desperate circumstances could justify. The evening brought Celia Hartwell home to St. Mary Mead with the quiet dignity of someone who had faced mortal danger and emerged victorious through intelligence rather than luck. She arrived on the London train, her traveling dress modest and practical, carrying a small suitcase and the composed bearing of a young woman who had discovered reserves of strength she never knew she possessed. Mrs. Hartwell's reunion with her niece unfolded in the drawing room where so many revelations had recently transformed their understanding of recent events, their embrace carrying the weight of relief mixed with the sobering knowledge of how close they had come to permanent separation. Miss Marple observed this homecoming with the gentle satisfaction she brought to mysteries resolved through patient observation and careful deduction. Inspector Slack, having secured his arrests and compiled a comprehensive report, departed for Much Benham with renewed appreciation for village observation, a skill he had previously dismissed as mere gossip. Mr. Pemberton, facing charges ranging from fraud to attempted murder, was remanded to custody in London, his smooth charm replaced by desperate fear as his network of similar schemes targeting vulnerable young women came under Scotland Yard investigation. Miss Fleming and Dr. Marson awaited their fate with the resignation of those whose good intentions had led them into criminal territory. The young woman's misguided loyalty had evolved from protective friendship into conspiracy, while the doctor's romantic attachment had corrupted his professional ethics beyond recognition. Their cases would require careful consideration of motivation versus action, though neither could escape the consequences of their choices, however well-intentioned their origins might have been. Robert Andrews, recovering from his poisoning with theatrical resilience, found himself a reluctant celebrity whose smoke effects had inadvertently enabled a real-life drama far more compelling than any stage production. His honest confession about the deception had earned him consideration for reduced charges, while his professional skills might yet find legitimate employment in London's theatrical companies, where smoke that concealed without choking remained a valuable commodity. Celia's account of her escape confirmed the details that had emerged through investigation while adding personal dimensions that completed the picture of systematic fraud disguised as romantic courtship. Her discovery of Pemberton's true circumstances had come through intercepted correspondence that revealed not only his financial desperation, but also his discussions with associates about insurance settlements and the convenient timing of accidents that might befall newly married wives with substantial inheritances. The realization that her fiancé planned her death had required courage that impressed even Inspector Slack, whose professional experience had accustomed him to victims who waited passively for rescue rather than engineering their own salvation. The bride's decision to orchestrate her own disappearance had served multiple purposes, creating confusion that enabled escape while simultaneously exposing the conspiracy's true nature through the reactions it provoked among participants. Her coordination with Miss Fleming, despite the risks involved, had demonstrated the sort of calculated bravery that transformed apparent victimhood into active resistance against predatory behavior that might otherwise have succeeded in its deadly purpose. The village's reaction to these revelations reflected the complex emotions that arise when familiar faces are revealed to harbor calculating hearts beneath trusted facades. Mrs. Weatherby declared herself thoroughly shocked by Dr. Morrison's behavior, while Colonel Bantry muttered about the difficulty of assessing character in modern times when traditional social indicators prove so unreliable. The general consensus painted Celia as remarkably brave while condemning those who had betrayed community trust through systematic deception. As the formal proceedings concluded and life slowly resumed its familiar rhythms, St. Mary Mead found itself forever changed by recent events. The garden of Thornfield House, once a symbol of idyllic English life, now carried the phantom echo of a disappearing bride, while the Blue Boar added a new Sunday pudding to its menu, Queen of Puddings with a Veil of Meringue, which Mr. Jones poetically named The Vanishing Bride, providing the village with a sweet memorial to their recent adventure. Miss Marple's role in unraveling the conspiracy earned recognition that she accepted with characteristic modesty, her gentle observations having provided the key insights that transformed apparent kidnapping into understood escape and revealed attempted murder disguised as accidental poisoning. Her patient reconstruction of evidence, combined with psychological understanding of human motivation under pressure, had enabled truth to emerge from layers of carefully constructed deception. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the village, now settling back into its peaceful routines, Miss Marple reflected on the lessons embedded in recent events, the complexity of human relationships, the power of financial desperation to corrupt moral judgment, the courage required to recognize and escape from mortal danger, all these elements had combined in ways that tested both individual character and community bonds. The bride who had vanished in smoke had demonstrated that sometimes salvation required dramatic measures that only desperate circumstances could justify. The scattered rose petals had been cleared away, but the questions they represented had bloomed into understanding that revealed both the darkness lurking beneath familiar facades and the intelligence required to recognize danger before it proved fatal. Human nature, she concluded, revealed its most essential qualities under pressure, and while the specific details of this mystery were unique, the underlying currents, greed, fear, loyalty, and courage, remained as constant as the changing seasons, destined to manifest themselves again in some new, unexpected form whenever ordinary people found themselves facing extraordinary circumstances that demanded choices between safety and conscience, between comfortable deception and dangerous truth. 3 weeks had passed since the dramatic events at Thornfield House, and autumn had settled over St. Mary Mead with the gentle certainty of seasons changing, though the village would never quite regard garden parties with the same innocent pleasure. Miss Marple sat in her cottage parlour, her knitting needles moving with practiced efficiency as she reflected on the curious case of the vanishing bride and the profound lessons it had revealed about human nature under extraordinary pressure. The afternoon post had brought a letter from Celia, now safely established with distant relatives in Devon, expressing gratitude for the gentle observations that had helped expose the conspiracy before it could claim its intended victim. The complete truth had emerged during Celia's testimony to Inspector Slack, delivered with the composed courage of someone who had faced mortal danger and emerged victorious through intelligence rather than luck. Her discovery of Pemberton's true intentions had come through a carelessly discarded letter, left in his coat pocket during one of his visits to Thornfield House. The correspondence, written to an associate in London, had discussed her inheritance with the cold calculation of a business transaction, mentioning the substantial life insurance policy he had secured on her life and the convenient timing that would make her death appear accidental shortly after their marriage. The casual tone of his planning, referring to her as merely a financial asset to be liquidated, had stripped away any remaining illusions about his affections and revealed the calculating heart that beat beneath his charming exterior. Her immediate confidant had been Miss Fleming, whose genuine alarm at learning of the murder plot had overcome any consideration of legal consequences. Together, they had devised the theatrical escape that would use Pemberton's own deception against him, creating confusion that would enable Celia's departure, while simultaneously exposing the conspiracy through the reactions it provoked among participants. The petroleum jelly and eucalyptus oil had been Celia's own precaution, remembered from wartime pamphlets about chemical protection, while the identical wedding dress found in Miss Fleming's room had served as crucial misdirection during the moment of substitution. Robert Andrews had been approached by Miss Fleming with precise specifications for theatrical smoke effects, though he remained unaware of the true gravity of the situation he was helping to orchestrate. His professional expertise had created the perfect concealment, dense enough to obscure vision completely, yet safe enough to avoid permanent harm to those caught within its billowing embrace. The brass key that had puzzled so many investigators had been Celia's own acquisition, obtained weeks earlier to ensure the Eastern Garden Gate could be opened without delay when the crucial moment arrived. The escape itself had required split-second timing coordinated with a railway schedule that Celia had memorized with the thoroughness of someone whose life depended on precise execution. Disguised in a traveling cloak beneath her wedding gown, she had slipped away through the gate during the confusion, reaching Quarry Lane in time to board the goods train that would carry her to safety in London. The intervening weeks had been spent in a modest boarding house, anxious but secure, waiting for the right moment to reveal herself and provide testimony that would ensure Pemberton's conviction while protecting those who had risked everything to help her escape. The legal proceedings had concluded with sentences that reflected both the severity of the crimes and the complex motivations that had driven ordinary people to extraordinary measures. Mr. Pemberton faced transportation for fraud and attempted murder, his network of similar schemes having claimed at least 2 other victims whose deaths had previously been attributed to accident or natural causes. Miss Fleming's genuine affection for Celia and the protective nature of her involvement earned consideration that reduced her charges, resulting in 6 months' imprisonment that seemed both just and merciful given her motivations. Dr. Morrison's case proved most troubling to the village, his attempted poisoning of Andrews having crossed professional boundaries that could not be overlooked, earning him 2 years' imprisonment and loss of his medical license. As the village slowly healed from these revelations, a subtle shift in its collective consciousness became apparent. The incident had served as a stark reminder that even in the most peaceful English communities, beneath the veneer of genteel society, could lurk greed and malevolence of the most calculating sort. Yet it had also highlighted the unexpected courage that could emerge when decent people faced with evil chose conscience over comfort, risking everything to protect the innocent from predatory behavior that might otherwise have succeeded in its deadly purpose. Miss Marple set aside her knitting as evening shadows lengthened across her garden, satisfied that justice had been served and that truth had emerged from the intricate web of deception that had threatened to claim an innocent life. The bride who had vanished in smoke had demonstrated that sometimes salvation required dramatic measures that only desperate circumstances could justify, while her escape had exposed a network of predatory behavior that extended far beyond St. Mary Mead into the darker corners of society, where vulnerable young women became targets for those who viewed marriage as merely another form of profitable crime. The scattered rose petals had been cleared away, but their symbolic significance lingered in the village's collective memory, as a reminder that appearances could deceive and that true character emerged only when tested by circumstances that demanded choices between safety and conscience. Human nature, she reflected, revealed its most essential qualities under pressure, and while the specific details of this mystery were unique, the underlying currents of greed, fear, loyalty, and courage remained as constant as the changing seasons, destined to manifest themselves again whenever ordinary people found themselves facing extraordinary circumstances that tested the very foundations of their moral character.